somebody looks good on the buffet, and I'm going, really, avoid that, man, don't even go near that.
Oh, really?
And that was the gist of it, that's the only part I remember.
Buffet of political choices? Or
No. Culinary choices. Yes.
Oh, man.
But it could have been a metaphor, actually, because there were some green dishes, and there were some yellow dishes, and some red ones, so maybe it was.
Because we get elected to council, we don't know what
we heard all that.
Right.
They're going to come in and start sitting at the walls.
Hello there, how are you? Good to see you. Did you figure out? I saw you today walking up the dock with your dog. Yeah. In a 4-hour meeting at Harvard, we're interviewing for a new night. Well, that was kind of always the intent. Was this transitional period.
Whatever you want to do.
It was temporary for her that lasted.
Okay.
So,
I guess that's the way it is then.
They're lovely. She like long dark hair and two just play on both of them. Okay, I think he's quite one of our parents.
Yeah.
I took over, I took the lead.
I don't know, I read that.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, business.
She basically said she wasn't there. It wasn't
Oh, yeah.
and like
Oh, way back. It's probably been about 20 years.
I was just glad that wasn't the wolf. I know.
it's supposed to be like
We have white.
Really?
yeah, she wants to
Oh, yeah, that's what my son's doing.
just like one of our things.
Yeah, we can make room if you want table.
No, I can have zero.
Oh, I do. I was wondering where to do that.
So now you have to keep them in mind.
In the sun, push on, so we would sweat. I feel like I feel gross. This is the shirt.
Well, we're really fortunate here. We decided to announce this year.
Well, we could eat
She might be.
We can hire them.
So I haven't seen church on that.
Sometimes things get sent.
Take this guy.
Well, I was in and out.
I'll dance for
What's
it.
in your bag?
2 years before the retirement.
Are you imagining
I'm pretty sure Alan does.
Thermal paper? Yeah, I think they were. Then you go and pull it over the file. There's going to be nothing on it.
They were positive.
Disappearing.
But they still, they were literally the first group that
I remember writing a letter for like Canada.
So they were just kind of hesitant.
In fact, I can't write the letter. And then get an answer.
So far, we've had one,
Even then.
So I decided to scrap my office.
You're gonna drop her off.
what it is.
She flies out to the group.
This is March 2020. She was invited to a quick presentation. So
She'll fly out to the same time.
Yeah, she actually would come right over there.
March is wonderful. March is like September.
November.
They were playing for 2021.
Yeah. She's gonna raise $5,500. She's already got a check.
She's maybe married their own family, but she can
Moving forward, we recognize this. We all have physical. Yeah, I'm looking at one.
Cool. Well, that's give you the insight into what you kind of think how different you want it. Very different. Like you don't want it.
When I leave this town, I don't want anything that will possibly buy this.
don't fly from Toronto. You flew to Toronto.
Never works.
You never moved to LA?
It's just never worked out. No, then you have graphical sense. Every color is
Oh, yeah, so good.
Toronto and Dallas.
You can fly anywhere in the world.
I told him the other day I love
We'll get to spend some time. We don't have to pay for nothing.
Yeah, apparently
I know, it's weird because we have had
it's not space.
The 1 minute rule.
That says 6 and that says 6. And since 6 is the time we start this meeting, we will start. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the District of Tofino's Committee of the Whole meeting for August 12th, 2019. I will call the meeting to order at 6 p.m. and recognize that we are conducting our business today in Taloquit territory. I'm going to start off by actually making a motion to amend tonight's agenda. So my motion is that the August 12th, 2019 Committee of the Whole agenda be amended to move the delegation from Joanna Streetley to follow item 3, which is adoption of the minutes, and to include a report from myself, the mayor, to follow Joanna Streetley's presentation.
Second.
Thank you. Seconded. Any discussion? All in favor? Thank you. Motion is carried. So with that, we have some minutes from the meeting, which is the committee of the whole meeting that was held on May 6th, 2019 for adoption. Move adoption.
Second.
Thank you. Moved and seconded. Any errors or omissions in the minutes? Seeing none. All in favor? Thank you. Motion is carried. And then next we have minutes from the special committee of the whole meeting that was held on June 3rd, 2019. Move adoption. Thank you.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any errors or omissions in those minutes? All right, seeing none. All in favor? Thank you. Motion is carried. And with that, I pass it over to you, Joanna, our poet laureate.
You guys have moved this. I thought it was over there. This was taller people. I would like to offer my condolence to Mayor and Council and staff on the death of Dorothy Baert. And I'd like to offer my condolence to the community of Tofino, family, friends, and colleagues for whom Dorothy has been an integral part of our lives. I worked at Tofino Sea Kayaking, Tom, for about 10 years in the 90s, so while I am the poet laureate, I am also very much affected by Dorothy in my life, so I have a bias. I'm announcing it. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who was the author of The Little Prince, among other books, wrote, "As for the future, your task is not to envision it, but to enable it." And Dorothy did both those things. Here we are in the unceded territory of Cloaquit, whose stewardship and systems of beliefs perpetuated a state in beauty and richness. And this is the same beauty and richness that inspired Dorothy to not only stand up for the land, hey Tasha, but to stand up for First Nations people and culture long before reconciliation was a word that is so familiar to us now. Recently, I had one of those brief dreams, the type where you're visited by a person but perhaps you never really see them. There was this loud sigh and a slap of a massive pile of papers being dropped onto a table beside me. "People just don't get it," said Dorothy's voice, and then she turned and she grabbed one of those thingies that you put the coffee into and she locked it into the espresso machine and hauled down on the handle. She was frustrated with the way people take this place for granted, with no concept of the fight that went into protecting it. It's a catch-22 that the same facility that allows us to adapt and evolve also causes us to forget and possibly not question what came before. 30 years ago in Tofino, there was commercial fishing and there was logging. Pick your livelihood. Dorothy wanted something different. She waded into the trenches to stop this place from being logged. She put hours and days and years of her life into that fight. Always she worried that complacency equals neglect, that if you're not fighting, then you're retreating. Knowing what it cost her, I think it was hard for Dorothy to see people take this place for granted, or to even not know what happened before they moved here, or they came here. But when Dorothy commissioned me to write and perform a poem for Tofino Sea Kayaking's 25th anniversary, which was 5 years ago, was it 5 years ago? It's 30 years now? I tried to express the way her dogged vision for the future, which was so at odds with the Tofino of that time. I mean, even her espresso machine was a first for Tofino, not only became a reality, but a model for other businesses to follow. And the poem was commissioned as a celebration, and for this reason the tone is light-hearted. I do also have a more serious poem about renewal, which and transformations that happen through deaths, and the value of physical reminders. So I have 2 poems. But we'll start with the light-hearted one that hopes to convey her sense of vision in the face of a completely different reality than we know today. For Dorothy. In the days when nabob was the norm and herring season swelled with overfull boats and cash-happy fishers brawling in the bars, you'd be forgiven for thinking that kayaks were crazy and cappuccinos were crazier. Which just goes to show how misunderstood genius can be. In the days when clear cuts were cool and M&B ruled from cut block to school, and yours was a jewel, you'd be forgiven for thinking that saving trees was loopy and hugging them was loopier. Which just goes to show how foresight can improve with hindsight. In the days when rain gear was rubber and gumboots weren't hunters, when Patagonia was a place, and Gore-Tex was one of those city things that would never catch on here, you'd be forgiven for thinking that paddlers weren't a market to be mined and dined and bedded and breakfasted, which just goes to show how the blind lead the blind. Unless there's someone who sees a new view, who sees the destination where others see only the road, the same old road, ruts deepening every day. It's the way things were on that side of the rainbow when Dorothy opened the door to her store, offered kayak rentals and more. And the tourists came through the years for the pleasure of kayaking and the roar of surf in their ears. They came for the views, for the beaches, for the trees. They came for the whales and the fish, for the cheese buns, schooner burgers, and alleyway eggs, for kayak store coffee, the only espresso in town. They came to stand up for the trees, block roads, get arrested, or for Tonquin beach parties. Où est la plage Tonquin? They came to bang drums and be free. And later they came for the spas, the pampering, the storm watching, oceanfront estates, hot stones massage, fine dining, surf. And suddenly it's not Kansas anymore. From the seed of kayak rentals, a family had grown staff who could haul boats, answer 3 phones at once, foam milk while checking the tides and answering the VHF, warn you of beaches where locals with chainsaws were known, once in a blue moon, to act a little wild. Ideas had grown too, whale watching, hot springs, multi-day kayaking trips, luxury tours with comfy beds, books to read and tent lanterns to read them by. Not any old books, mind you, but good books, well chosen, perfect company. It seemed we only blinked and the years were gone. Trundled under the wheel of time, rolled into the past tense, summer after mad summer, twirling to the distant horizon like water from a dipped paddle, and the bow of the boat still pointing seaward. 25 years. You'd be forgiven for thinking it wasn't possible. And then this May, I went to England and I went to the Deerton Natural Burial Park, which is where my mother was buried 10 years ago, 11, I guess. And it's one of those places where you're not allowed to have headstones and that you just plant a tree and everything becomes very transformed. And I realized that I had spent all this time and all these years of not having been able to really go to that place, of carrying around all these feelings, and on going there, I realized that how very important it is to have a place to go to remember a person, and to be able to put those feelings down. And on top of that, the wonderful thing about going there was that it was May, and the tree that had been planted for my mother was now in full bloom and covered in white flowers and now as tall as the ceiling. And so there was something so overwhelmingly uplifting and beautiful about the transformation, and the combination of the transformation of a person, but also the just being able to be in a place where you could think about that person. And the poem's written as a fugue, which in music, a fugue is a type of composition where the melody repeats, and it repeats in lots of different variations. And fugues in poetry, often you have a few beginning lines, and they get repeated throughout the poem. This is called Fugue for the Mounded Earth. When there are bones in a place, bones you belong to. When there are bones and earth is mounded there, and when you can be still, still with the mounded earth and the bones you belong to, and the tree you belong to, the tree the robin sings from, the tree that is your mother, the becoming of her, her new leaves, the white paint of her blossoms, and the stillness and the mounded earth, the sense of time beginning here in this place, this beginning place, this ending place. When at last there are bones in a place, bones you belong to, and when at last you feel the falling to ground of your longing, the calling home of you, the deep reach of the bones from the mounded earth and the young tree and the stillness and the robin. Then, at last from your root-bound heart, a tendril. So I'd just like to finish with one more quote from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. He is one of my favorite people. And he also wrote that if you want to build a ship, don't drum up people to collect wood and don't assign tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. And in so many ways, Dorothy did this, both with her business and with Claquet Sound. And along the way, she encouraged and inspired many others to do the same. And so it's my hope that Tofino can find some lasting way or place to honor Dorothy's legacy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joanna, and everyone for being here to witness that. Thank you for being here, John.
Oh, and if there's ever any momentum toward a legacy for Dorothy, I would love to be involved somehow, so
Thank you.
feel free to let me know.
I think that a discussion has started in several corners of the community and something will be coming forward, so.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So whilst it may seem a hard act to follow, we do have two delegates who are here to speak to us about a housing project, but it actually is really suitable because Councillor Baert was very, very passionate about housing for Tofino. So it's a really nice segue, actually, and I would invite you both up, Terry and Frank, to speak to us about your project. And because our other person is not here, we will do it after. I didn't even see her. Yeah. So you have up to 10 minutes to make your presentation, and if you need a little longer, then we just need to do it formally by resolution. But
Okay, I think I can do it all in 10 minutes.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I want to just thank Mayor and Council for giving us the opportunity to present to you tonight. My name is Frank Limshue. I'm the Development Manager for WestUrban Developments. With me is Terry Hoff. He's a partner with the company. He is also the Chief Operating Officer for WestUrban. So before I get into the heart of the discussion, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time just introducing who we are and what we do. So WestUrban is a Vancouver Island-based land development company. Our staff, our owners live and work on Vancouver Island. Having said that, we do have projects not just on Vancouver Island, but also on the mainland and in the interior, and I'll get into that a little bit more. We specialize in purpose-built rentals. And so these are market rental units. They're not subsidized housing. In a lot of communities where we are working, we do enter into rental agreements just to ensure that at the end of the day, the product is what we say it's going to be. And it provides certainty for those local jurisdictions as well. We specialize in complex sites, and a lot of our sites are basically infill development. So these are sites that have already been developed, typically in more urban areas. Not very many greenfield projects. And as a company, we are a fully integrated company. And so by that, what I mean is we'll find the sites, we will work with the community, the staff, council to come up with a plan. Ultimately, once I've received all the approvals through rezonings, development permits, or subdivisions, or all of the above, we then have a building team that will actually go out and construct the project. Once it's constructed, we then will rent it out and manage it. So it's full cycle, a full cycle company. So on the screen, these are just examples of some of the projects that we have on the books right now. We've probably got about 18 projects on our project list. Of the 18, 8 of them are currently under construction. The projects that you see in front of you are projects that are either under construction or at various stages of development approval. So the Parksville project, we just received, we went through a rezoning for the 74-unit rental building. We received development permit, and we're just at the stage now where we're looking to get a building permit to construct that. The Squamish project are 2 buildings, 38-unit and 40-unit. The 40-unit project we actually received a development permit for, and that's underway. So if you were to go to the site, we've started pouring concrete. The picture below is a picture of our CEO in the center. His name is Sean Roy. He's the other partner of WestUrban. And with him is the Minister of Housing, and at the very end is the Mayor of Squamish. That's the groundbreaking ceremony for the building on the right. The Nanaimo site, we are currently going through a rezoning right now. We've received 3rd reading, and it's, again, a purpose-built rental building for approximately 213 units. The site that I really want to talk to you about today, and this is through my discussions with the planning department. They had suggested that perhaps I should come to council and just discuss the idea of purpose-built rental in this particular location. So the site is located at 1151 Pacific Rim Highway. It's basically at the corner of the Pacific Rim Highway and I believe Helsing Drive. In front of you, I've given everyone a handout. You can see the survey on the first sketch plan, so it should be this plan here. Basically, what that survey outlines is what's currently on the property. So basically, the site is currently used as a single-family resident, and what we would like to do is to go through the rezoning process to convert or redevelop that site into apartment units. And so, the sketch plan that you have in front of you is basically a sort of our first kick at the can, if you will, with respect to what we think we could accommodate on that parcel. As I indicated, we'd have to go through a rezoning process. The site plan that you see in front of you outlines a project that would encompass 38 rental units. They would vary in size. So it'd be a mix of studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, and even 3 bedrooms. Just to try and appeal to a variety of people, different groups, and so forth. But I guess there's a couple things that I want to just kind of bring to council's attention. So in order to accomplish the 38 units on the site, we are looking at a 4-story building. And we will be looking at a relaxation to your parking requirements. So right now, on this layout, we have 38 units, and we're providing for 39 parking stalls. So basically, it's a 1-to-1 ratio, which I know doesn't quite meet your parking standards. So I just wanted to flag those 2 things, the 4-story and the parking ratio, because it could be a potential issue for council. And the point of us coming tonight was really to present this idea for that site and to get a feel from council as to whether or not we're on the right track, whether this is something council could see themselves entertaining if we were to make a formal application for rezoning, or whether we're totally off-site, in which case I'd like to hear that as well. That way I won't be wasting your time and staff's time working on a project that won't go anywhere. Terry, would you like to add anything before?
No, I'd like to first of all say thank you for giving us the opportunity. WestUrban is about coming up on 3 years old. Sean Roy, the CEO of the company, has been in the business for about 16 years. I've been with WestUrban since inception. Prior to that, I worked in Northern Alberta for 10 and a half years, and prior to that, I was in pulp and paper for 27 years. One of the things that we really do with WestUrban is we are sort of experts on infill development. So we like to build on smaller sites. If you have a chance to look on our website, you'll see a lot of the builds that we are currently building right now. A lot of them are on very, very tight sites. We like working in small communities, but we are a rental company. We're not in the condo business. We're not into building rentals and flipping them into condos. We go into communities. We're working very closely with BC Housing. We are a preferred builder selected by BC Housing. We were the first development corporation that got vetted through BC Housing and has been approved. And they are partners with us on 4 builds right now in Squamish, Parksville, Comox Valley, and the 4th project is in Nanaimo as well. So 4 projects with them. So BC Housing's mandate is to create rental stock pretty much in every community in British Columbia. And obviously, I'm not an expert in Tofino, but I do know that there's not a lot of rental accommodations in Tofino. So we build rental units, we sign rental covenants, so we're not in the business of flipping buildings and flipping units. We want to provide critical rental stock. We manage them, we're present, and we build really nice quality buildings, and we like to conform to the character of the communities of which we build. So we're always looking for input and feedback within our design. Our architect is from Squamish. She was born in Cumberland, so she's got a good feel for the culture of Vancouver Island. We want to respect those communities where we do business. We work very closely with First Nations. It's an important part of our company. We're doing a couple of projects with Cowichan tribes in Cowichan on the banks of the Cowichan River, so it's really important that when we come into a community and talk to them about doing a development, is we want to come in from a position of gathering information as opposed to coming in and trying to transform a community. For us, it's about developing projects in areas that have a great need for rental, which is pretty much everywhere in Vancouver Island, and sure in Tofino it's even more heightened with the fact of the visitors that come here annually and the amount of people that work here as a result. So thank you for giving us the opportunity to present, and if time allows, if there are any questions, please ask them if that's allowed in this process.
Absolutely, yeah, no, absolutely it is.
Thank you. Just to carry on Terry's point, because I think it's an important one, is if you look at our project list there, and you look at the buildings, they don't all look the same.
Right.
Right? And so we pay a lot of attention to design guidelines for the various communities, because we recognize that every community has its own identity, its own cadence, and how it does things, and certainly we want to be a part of that community. So we don't look at a community as just kind of a one-off. And most of the, if you go on our website, you'll see that we have more than one project in a lot of the communities that we're working in. The last thing I just want to end up with is, the question tonight is really about land use, but I just want to leave you with these images. I mean, these are some of the images that we're tinkering with, if you will, for the overall look of the building, because we realize once we get through the reality, we'll also be going through a development permit process with the community. So as Terry alluded to, we're here to answer any questions or comments, certainly any comments that you might have.
Terrific. Okay, I'm sure there are both
Yes.
comments and questions. I'm really happy to entertain them now, so I'll turn it over to council or committee. Anybody want to start?
Sure, I'll go for it. I'm supportive of definitely apartment housing for this town. The 4 stories I'm a little concerned about and what that would look like in that space, but we need to kind of think about that a little bit. Those are kind of my first thoughts on it. But definitely I think the idea is what we need to help with housing out here. Thank you.
Councillor Stewart?
Well, I'm sure you've done your market research and recognize the need for housing, purpose-built rental, obviously. A couple of the questions that I have in mind, in terms of affordability, which are one of the, we have a housing corporation here, the District of Tofino, and affordability often comes up in our conversations. When you talk about market rates, at this stage, I'm sure it's very early, but I'm always curious as to what market rates might look like in terms of the affordability factor for your potential renters in Tofino.
It's actually a hard question to answer at this stage in the game because we really don't know our unit counts or whether or not we have a project. Because if Tofino said to us, look, we like the idea of rental, but we'll only allow you to do half the units, well, we may not even have a project, right? So a lot of times what happens is our rental rates are predicated on the cost associated with constructing those buildings. So I've always tried to hold off. I'll give it a number because once you state the number, it's kind of set in stone. But for like I say, it's predicated on cost and ultimately the number of units that we're able to put on site. Certainly, it's in our best interest to have a fully rented out building. And so, if we miss the mark and our rental rates are too high, then no one's going to be able to rent there, and that defeats the whole purpose. And at the same time, it leaves a black mark in there, for everyone, ourselves and yourselves as a community. And so we certainly don't want to do that because we all live on the island. We all know that the island overall is a small community. So if we have a misstep in any one of the communities that we're working in, I'm pretty sure you'll hear about it fairly quickly.
Thank you.
If I could just add just a little bit to that, one of the things that we recognize in communities like Tofino, like say a one-bedroom condo, or bedroom apartment building, when they're designed, so that they're pretty good size. So, we fully anticipate you'll see like a Murphy bed set up in a living room in a place like Tofino, where you're likely going to see two people share a one bedroom, which is probably not uncommon here. And then at that particular situation, it becomes pretty affordable when two people are sharing a one bedroom. We're seeing that in a supply mall where we met with the planning staff council and they said, make sure you put 3-bedroom units in the design of your building. So we go and we design the building that's on our website. We go back before council for first and second reading, and then they go, no, this is not a family neighborhood. We want you to take the 3 bedrooms out. And that's probably the case here. I mean, you guys may want a few 3 bedrooms, but probably 1 and 2 bedrooms and bachelors are more of the mix in the building that probably makes sense in this area. And that only comes just by understanding a bit of the dynamics of the workforce in Tofino. But those are the kind of things that we like to hear feedback on, saying, guys, we think you're wrong with 3 bedrooms. If we get to that stage where you guys think we can endorse something like this, and we recognize we're a long ways away from going through the rezoning and stuff, but we really want to hear that feedback. There's no sense of us designing a building that doesn't meet the practical needs of your community.
Sorry, another quick question. Thanks. I think I misunderstood you. I thought you'd said there was 39 stalls, but I'm just looking at this and it says 29. So it's 38. Am I reading this wrong?
29 is
39.
Oh, and then there's also, okay, so there. Thank you.
Handicap stalls, and then there's small cars, 39.
Now, there's no doubt there's a demand for rentals in Tofino. I am concerned about the height. I have gone on record of saying I'll support going over the height specifications if the terrain allows, which it doesn't in here because it's basically flat. And or if it's affordable, I just wondered if there was any opportunity to make some of the units affordable. And I realise you want to do mainly market, but if a certain percentage could be deemed as affordable. I like having a mixed use of sizes, and it would be nice to see a mix of families, seniors and young people in there.
Thanks.
Definitely take your comments.
I just want, of course, to gesture towards a concern about the height. which I think will be probably the thing that you'll hear the most from the community. But to Councillor McMaster's point, I think that we can either go for density and affordability, or for many concerns about height. I think that we might have to decide on one as the community. So I think while I understand that nobody wants to talk about numbers hard and fast at the beginning, that our community might be more receptive to understanding the need for 4 stories and a higher density if you really are talking firmer numbers that make it look a little bit more affordable, because that's what would make it more palatable to me. I understand that there is a market rate, but there is a difference between what people can pay, what they will pay, and what they should pay.
I'm having a problem with the connection.
And what, me too, and what they should pay in Tofino. And I think you're right, there will be 2 people that will share a 1-bedroom, but whether that is what is desirable here might be something different altogether. So I think what everyone has gestured to, that the height will be one of the biggest concerns, may possibly be waylaid by actual firm numbers about what you're talking about and the correlation between density and affordability.
I knew that height was going to be an issue. Just, all you have to do is really drive around town, and there really aren't any buildings. There's probably 1 or 2 4 stories. And on this particular site, it's fairly flat. It's got a lot of mature trees on the perimeter of the property and within the road right-of-way. And so, and it's basically right across from a plaza that has Tofino in it. So it's just a bit of a node established there already with that plaza, and then you've got the townhouse project right across the street. But I guess my point on the height is that if we can preserve a lot of those mature vegetation around, especially around the perimeter, visually, you will not notice whether the building is 3 stories or 4 stories. And certainly, the onus is on us to demonstrate that to you. But I just wanted to make that observation.
Thanks. I think your comments just now probably answer most of the types of questions I was going to ask, but it's 4 stories because it's parking and then 3 stories of living on top.
No, what we're thinking about is parking underneath, so we're trying to hide the parking.
Yeah.
So in order to get our full 39 stalls, there'll be parking underneath the building.
Got it.
So I mean, we're still early days because I still have to do some geotechnical work to make sure that I can actually get underground parking in that area. And then our building would be 4-story wood frame construction above the parking.
Okay. Yeah, I think I would share the concerns that have already been expressed around height, and from this perspective, that I don't think that Tofino Council or Tofino itself is averse to densifying, but that most of our efforts to do that are downtown, and so we're more naturally going to find the want for taller buildings in downtown, and I think they would fit nicely there. But that corridor leading up through the neck of Tofino, where we're really used to the green, and there's always been a lot of concern. Yeah, exactly.
And so that's why I raised the point about the existing.
And thank you for being proactive about that. So your point about the node is well taken, and I think you're right too. And that's something I think I want to give more thought to and hear from our staff more about what, we're right in the middle of an OCP rewrite. And so deciding, and personally I'm in favor of developing some nodes that are away from downtown as much as preserving the downtown vitality and character, but giving people an opportunity to get some of their services not necessarily downtown, I think is a good thing in the long run for Tofino. But, and then, I think seeing renderings or elevations that help to put things in scale so that you can understand better how the trees are going to fit. But then I just have to say, all that being said, we've had a lot of people come to us and tell us that they're going to preserve the green space, and quite frankly, it hasn't been. Yeah. So when you get into the site, you realize that some trees are compromised and they have to come down in the end, and that's always been a real kind of disappointment and letdown for Tofitians who care deeply about trees. So I would not discourage you from moving forward, and I think by submitting a rezoning application, obviously you've had some preliminary conversation with our staff, but having that opportunity for them to dive in deeper and give us the benefit of their expertise and feedback is always a good thing for council and the community. But I recognize you want to, you're hedging your bets a little bit, and you don't want to spend money that's going to be wasted. So,
I mean, certainly if council said to us tonight, look, sort of over our dead bodies, will we support something like this? Because it's
Right.
the wrong spot, wrong location, too dense.
Yeah.
I mean, that's actually valuable feedback for us as well,
Right.
because it, like I say, I just don't want to waste anyone's time with something that isn't going to fly.
Yeah.
What I'm getting from you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's support for the use.
Mhm.
The issue is going to be how we deal with the height. And certainly with the height, the density associated with it. And how do we preserve the character that is Tofino on that site? So so it's going to be a bit of a balancing act for us. But I'm leaning towards this has been a positive exercise, and certainly we'll talk about it on our ride back. But I'm getting more positives than negatives. Right? And I didn't hear any showstoppers at this point in time.
I don't think
And
so.
we heard your concerns with regards to affordability as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think market rental is an important part of the rental
Right.
offerings here. We just don't have very many, so
Yeah.
I don't think that's a bad thing for Tofino, and I think there's a market out there for it. And as you go forward too, doing your pro formas and looking more at, like the sizes that you're proposing are it's helpful that they're not huge, because that's going to keep it more affordable. And you'll start looking at that balance of mix and size and density and whether it really makes financial sense for you or not. And we'll learn through that too. Is there anything you wanted to add at this point, Bob or Aaron?
I just wanted to just clarify, do you gentlemen own the property yet?
It's under contract.
It's under contract.
Got it.
And so these are just big decisions to
Yeah.
make for council,
Yeah.
pre-staff having a really good look at it. I know there's been significant conversations with Peter, our planner. Concerns that we definitely have are height, mass, and traffic's a really big one for there, for 38 units on that corner. That's already gotten quite busy, is something we want to look at. The floodplain rules that are becoming tsunami evacuation routes. There's a lot of stuff that has yet to be delved into in detail. So these are kind of the other items that we would take a look at if this moves forward.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Okay, thank you very much
Thanks
for your
very
time.
much for taking the time to
appreciated.
come. Yeah,
Thank you.
likewise. Okay, great. Okay, so we are going to move on to one of the things that this council and councils of the past really enjoy doing, which is recognizing a member of our community for their incredible service and contribution to this town. We've had a volunteer service recognition program for the last 6.5 years or so, kind of reinstituting a program of old. And we solicit nominations from the community, and they come forward, and we have a small committee that reviews them and has the very, very, very difficult job of selecting a person to receive this, or a group of people to receive this throughout the year. And there is a person who's in this room tonight who now has figured out what's going on, because she's wondering, why are they making me sit in this chair? Because I have stuff to do. And it's the stuff that you do, Sandy, that we want to take the time to say thank you so much for what you do. So this is Sandy Rideout. Sandy has been a member of our community for a long time, and she is one of the most dedicated and wonderful movie watchers and movie givers, in that she gives to the community by carefully selecting a finely tuned set of movies that she delivers to our community every Monday night. And it is such a pleasure to be part of a community that has a Monday night movie program. We're such a tiny town, and yet we have a movie theater, and we have movies that are shown in it. So Sandy, we can't thank you enough for the work that you do to bring entertainment and serious issues. And because I often work in the back here, and every Monday Sandy comes in and she does the work that she does to get everything ready, and pretty much every Monday we have a chance to connect and chat about things. And so I know that Sandy cares really deeply about this community, and that she's very passionate, as her nominator said, very passionate about keeping a vibrant arts and culture scene in Tofino and maintaining the operation of the theater. So Sandy, on behalf of council and the District of Tofino, we want to say thank you. We're going to put your name on a plaque that's going to go over there on the sidewalk hall of fame, and we have this for you. So please come and receive it. Usually people that get this do a lot of stuff. I do one thing consistently for a long time.
And in the 15
And
years.
we have a photographer here. Can I ask council to come up and do you mind if we get a photo? Because we have to brag about you.
I got dogs.
Over here. Come right over here in front of the. All right.
Thank you very much.
Boys on the side.
Boys flanking. Yeah. All right. Oh, thank you so much for taking the photo.
You can video this short.
Thank you. Okay, now we'll let you do the work that you have to do. Thank you. Have a fun movie tonight.
Avengers Endgame is the 22nd movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Thanks for coming back, everybody. You're all ready now. All right. So, next we're going to move on to Tamsin. And I don't know if Keith has any introductory remarks to make.
Yes, I do.
Oh, good. This is fantastic. Okay, so thank you for a very comprehensive flood risk assessment report.
Sorry about that.
And no, don't apologize. We appreciate it. It's important stuff.
Good evening, Mayor and councillors, and thanks for your time. So we're here tonight to present the final report for the comprehensive coastal flood risk assessment. I'll just give a brief overview of the project. I'm sure you've read through it all, or started. And then introduce our consultant from Ebbwater to present the report, and then Aaron will conclude the presentation with a commentary on next steps. So as you know, the District of Fino is at risk from coastal flooding due to both storms and tsunamis. And this risk is changing with sea level rise and other climate change induced impacts. With this in mind, the district took a proactive approach to understanding the risk that these flood hazards pose to our community. In May of 2018, the district secured funding through the National Disaster Mitigation Program and contracted Ebbwater Consulting and its partners to provide a risk assessment for coastal flood hazards. The coastal flood risk assessment built upon previous flood hazard mapping work that began in 2018, and that mapping, the deliverables from that were a key input to this project. So the three main objectives for the coastal flood risk assessment were to assess coastal storm and tsunami flood risk, including sea level rise, in a holistic way that explored social, economic, cultural, and environmental consequences. This included stakeholder workshops attended by a diverse group of community organizations, businesses, and individuals. The second objective was to provide recommendations to move towards a flood resilient community and to update and improve tsunami emergency programs. And the third objective was to translate findings into meaningful input for local land development policy and planning. The report was completed in mid-July and lays the groundwork for mitigating flood risks for our community. So with that said, I'd like to introduce you to Tamsin Lyle, Principal at Ebbwater Consulting, to present the Coastal Flood Risk Assessment Final Report. But before Tamsin gets into the report, first I'd like to formally thank the whole project team for going above and beyond in producing the assessment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor and Council, for having me here today to talk about something that I also think is truly important, and I imagine that you all do too, because you all live here. And apologies for the very lengthy report. You didn't have to read all of it. There was an abstract, but it was only 300 words at the beginning. But it's very lengthy because there was rather a lot of information. We were dealing with a whole bunch of different issues here. So, I encourage you to ask questions as we go along. I'm going to try and be as efficient as I possibly can be, but there was obviously a lot of information. But I can skip over all this because Keith's done this for me. So with the project objectives, timeline, so as Keith said, this did build on a project that we also completed, I'm going to say December of last year, to actually map the hazards and figure out what was going on in terms of coastal flood risk here in the region.
focusing in on the District of Tofino itself, but there are a lot of issues that are really regional scale. So especially when we start looking at things like tsunami, it's really important that you recognize that there's a regional element to this project and to that problem, and that working with neighbors is going to be truly, truly important going forward. So just to get everyone going, I know some of you, in fact, we could do a quiz, because there were members of the council who sat in on some of our workshops and should be able to define risk properly for us. And what I mean by properly is technically. So in the field of disaster risk reduction, we use risk in a very specific way, looking at risk as the combination of hazard, so the bad thing, in this case tsunami or a coastal storm, exposure, the elements that are in the way of that bad thing, whether it be people or buildings or infrastructure or cultural aspects or trees, and the vulnerability of these elements, so how these elements interact with water when they are hit with it. Do they withstand it? Do they recover quickly? Or are they devastated by the impact of the hazard? So we think about all of these three things, and the presentation will go through these in order sort of fairly quickly. Starting with hazard, the bad thing. So in this case, we were dealing with two separate types of flood hazards. The tsunami hazard, as well as the coastal storm hazards, which in and themselves are really varied and wide. So obviously, when you have water in your home or in your on your beaches, it matters how deep that water is. It matters how much warning you had to get to know that that water was coming. It matters how fast that water is moving, how much energy there is. All of these things really play into the vulnerability of all of these elements. So it's important to consider these. And when we think about tsunami and coastal hazards from a storm, they're quite different. And so we're going to have to sort of characterize these things differently to understand them, and then ultimately to understand what you can do about them, because the responses are also different. So the main things that we did look at were tsunami, and I'm going to explain later why that's a terrible graphic to be using for tsunami, but it's the one that everybody understands, so we're going to go with it. We also looked at the combined coastal flood from storm surge and tides, so there's all things we know about, deterministic things, tides. We also, then they vary throughout the year, and also then there's storm surge and wave and run-up that result when you have those large coastal storms that come in. They basically suck the water up because the pressure decreases, and then the waves are on top of that, so you end up with elevated water levels. And then, of course, we have climate change, which is creating sea level rise. So we know the oceans around the world are rising as a result of a bunch of things. And I think I always like this graphic because I think everyone thinks about sea level rise and thinks about the glaciers melting. But actually, a lot of this is being derived from the waters warming up. And that, if you go back to grade 3 science, you'll remember that water expands as it warms, and that's basically what's happening. And so there is a scenario where you have global sea level rise, and then locally the sea level rise is happening here. But we're lucky in the grand scheme of the world, just because our waters are cooler over here, even in El Nino years. And so compared to our global family and friends, we're pretty awesome here because we're only expecting about 1 meter of sea level rise between now and the end of the century, whereas on the east coast of North America, it's going to be closer to 3 or 4 meters, so there's quite a big difference. And so 1 meter is still a lot, and we'll show you what that means, but it is sort of more manageable as something that I think the District of Tofino can take on and manage proactively with the information that's out there. So what does that mean? So unfortunately, of course, you all have access to these maps, and we provided them in many different ways to the District of Tofino, so I'm sure you'll all have access to them on your internal sites, and there's all of these maps that you can zoom into in your own time. But this essentially shows the expected extent and depth of maps. The darker the blue, the more deep the water, for a fairly large storm event if it were to occur today. And so you can right away see that the areas that you would expect, you all live here. Your Tofetians, my new word for the night, and you know where those low-lying areas are. It really isn't rocket science when it comes down to it. And so what I want to draw your attention to, though, is when we add sea level rise to the map, what happens? There's a lot more extent. So the area increases, especially in Chesterman Beach and Hawke's Bay area, and the water gets deeper and deeper matters because that's more damaging. We'll have more energy, it'll get in further. So these are sort of some important elements that sort of preface the work that we did. I'm glad to see that your development site is not on the map.
That's good.
Okay, phew. So that's this very brief high-level hazard. You can reach the 200-tome report that we submitted in January, I think, of this year if you want to go into the details of the map. It's pretty fun, but it's only for you if you really like math. Okay, so the other hazard, which is probably the one that maybe you think about more because it's the stuff of movies, not the slow-moving sea-level rise scenario, but the tsunami. And so here on the west coast, obviously, there is a high hazard for tsunami from two types of tsunamis, or two sources of tsunamis. So tsunamis are created when water is displaced. Usually in this case because of an earthquake, it can be landslides as well that would generate a tsunami. And the scenario here on the Ring of Fire is that there's two basic places where we're going to see a tsunami or an earthquake that would generate a tsunami over in Japan, and more importantly and more scarily, I guess, here right on the coast. Again, I'm sure you're all very aware of this. But if we were to have a Cascadia rupture, so that's the fault line that's just off the side of Vancouver Island here, it would create a fairly large tsunami wave in about 20 minutes. It'd be hitting your coast. And just going back to that statement I made earlier about that icon, that is the wrong icon, because that's not the wave. So it's not going to be that scary. What's going to happen is you're going to see over the course of those 20 minutes, or about half an hour, I think the length of the wave is basically a very large high tide just surging up the side of the coastline. So it's not this big gigantic wave that's going to terrify you and become YouTube hits. It's going to be a much slower event, but still extremely damaging. If you were in the workshops, you got to see lots of images of the Japanese 2011 Tohoku tsunami, which according to our tsunami experts who are on our team, would be what would be expected here in terms of what it looks like. And so you can always go to YouTube tonight if you want to not sleep and look at what that scenario looks like. But it's a lot of mass, so it's just a lot of volume of water carrying a lot of debris, and so that's a really big issue here as well. And so what does that look like as it comes onto your coast? No pretty videos here. Just another map. We have to use different colors for tsunami mapping because the depths are so much more extreme. The reds there are over 8 meters of depth, and the blues are in the 2 to 4 meters of water there. So that's the extent and depths of flooding that are anticipated based on the sort of very high level tsunami mapping and modeling that was done for this project. And so right away, I think your eyes are drawn to
where to go.
Where to go, exactly. So there are places to go, and I think that's what this is all about, is really being informed about where those places are. So that one of the big premises, or a lot of the work that we focused on here was focused on using the framework, which is called the Sendai framework, which is an international framework for disaster risk reduction. And understanding risk is the very first premise of that, because you can't do anything about it until you understand it. And so it is a bit scary to know, but on the other hand, if you didn't know, that might be even scarier in the moment. Okay, now that we got that bad stuff out of the way, the hazard, the bad thing, let's think about how that bad thing interacts with this community. Impacts are extremely diverse, and I would say one of the objectives of this project in particular was the concept of looking at this in a holistic way, because just through this council meeting, I've sort of learned a little bit more about your community and understanding that there's a lot more to this community than just the buildings that are here. It's the people that are here, it's the trees that you fought for 30 years ago. Those are the things that matter, and so that was something that we recognized that was valuable to this community as well as all the other communities that we work in. And we wanted to explore all of those things and not just focus on the things that engineers like to calculate, which is how much buildings cost and how much they're going to cost when they get pushed over by a tsunami. And so we did want to look at some of those environmental issues, social issues, cultural issues. However, and we had to do this in a way that we could understand simply and that met the requirements of the funding agency, because Keith and Aaron got us some fantastic funding from the National Disaster Mitigation Program. And so this is what's called the National Risk Profile. And so we put things into buckets that try to consider a wide variety of impacts. The challenge, of course, is that lots of those things, especially when we start thinking about people or loss of life or cultural impacts, especially to the local First Nations, we can't generally measure that or calculate that. That's not something that we have tools to do very well. And we certainly don't have calculations to do that. So we need to be able to remember that there are things that we weren't able to calculate, but we did our best to try and talk to the community to try and gather as much information as possible so that we didn't ignore it, because what measures matters, and if you're making decisions on behalf of the information, you're going to be constrained in the future. So to do that, we came and talked to you, and you were lovely. We did, I think over the course of this project, 3 separate engagements with the community, 2 stakeholder meetings, one back in the fall where we sat down with some of you and asked you what you cared about in the floodplain in these hazard areas, and we took away that information and used it. We came back and checked that in the spring, and we also had someone out here for Planapalooza to try and talk to the local community as well, to try and sort of understand some of these things. And so you'll recognize some of your faces in those pictures. We also used data, of course. We love GIS, we love maps, and I hope you love maps too, because this entire presentation is maps. So we did use whatever data was available from your great GIS folks, as well as collecting data from our partners at the federal government and our CAN. We have a lot of relationships with them. We were using a lot of data. And so, in terms of the coastal storm, I'm going to run through these quite quickly. You can go back to that fantastically long report should you want to learn more, just to draw out some of the big things. And so starting with coastal storm, and I think don't think of them as one being more important than the other, and I'll get to that at the end, but I did need a way to sort of separate out the presentation. Starting with people. So I think right away here are what we're showing, and the quickly odd, I don't know what color that is, orangey green, are areas where people will be when there is, or people live currently, or have homes, or have places of work where floodwaters are expected. And I think this particular one is a bit of a mix of today and in the future with sea level rise. And so right away your eyes are drawn to Chesterman Beach, Cox Bay, a little bit here down in the town. But those are the areas where, and I'm sure if you live here, you know these areas, it's obvious to you. It's the low-lying areas exposed to the Pacific coast that are going to be impacted. And so that's where people will also be impacted. I think what's very important in the story of this is also the broader regional impacts to people that will be expected. So Tofino is the hub for so many other communities along the coast, and so it's important to not forget about them, because they're going to be facing that same storm, that same tsunami. And so it really is a regional problem when you think about this, when you think about the access to all of these communities and where they source some of their main supplies. When we think about dollar values, that's obviously something that a lot of people care about. It's also something that can sometimes get the attention of higher level governments when you're looking for funding, so take note. We looked at the property values to give us an idea of the proxy of what is the economic cost of a large coastal storm. And the exposed value in the floodplain today is about $61 million. And with 1 meter of sea level rise, that doubles. And that's because mostly it's the Chesterman Beach area where that 1 meter of sea level rise really drives that flood extent further inland. And there's just so many more. It goes into the second row of houses, or third row of houses, and that really increases the value of the property that would be impacted by a coastal flood. So those are fairly large numbers, especially for a community like Tofino, but I'm sure you recognize that given the types of properties that are out there. Another thing that I think that's very important if you think about the cohesiveness of the community and the ability of the community to function is thinking about critical infrastructure. Is it in the floodplain? Will it be compromised in a flood event? For the most part, you've been smart. All of the really important stuff, apart from a few pump stations, are out of the floodplain. There are roads, obviously, and some overhanging electrical lines and that kind of things that are in the floodplain. But these are the kind of thing that actually, you can do something about over time, raising these roads, that kind of thing. But they're all identified now on our handy dandy maps. Don't want to forget the environment, obviously a huge issue. You have a lot of parkland, very beautiful. In itself, it's also a buffer. It has a lot of value in terms of reducing the power of these storm events. You also have a lot of tanks, what are they called? I know this word. I just came back from my parents' house. They're on a septic system. There we go. You have a lot of septic tanks, and these are all in the floodplain. And so with a coastal storm, there is a small chance that these might be damaged or exposed.
I don't believe we have.
We don't have. Okay. Well then, we may have some poor information.
I could be stood correct, but as far as I know, we have limited to no.
Limited septic.
It's septic.
We had a lot of septic marked on the map, so we'll have to go back and fix that now. We'll have to have an amendment. Thank you.
There's tanks.
There's tanks.
There may be some ones there that are left over from
some residual
Yeah.
of the 70s and the 80s
Tanks
that we
that
don't
aren't
know
functioning
about.
anymore.
Yeah.
That would not be part of
We don't monitor
That's good to know. That, well, we'll just know this map, but which is really good to know. But it's obviously something going forward that I think is important that you continue that scenario where you're not putting contaminants, whether it's a gas station or a storage facility for something else in the floodplain, because right away as soon as that gets wet, it's going to spread that all over your beautiful beaches and forests. So it's important to consider. We'll have to go back and check that. And this I just wanted to highlight as our sort of cultural layer, that it was very weak, and that was because we really didn't have a lot of information, and that is something I think that needs to be improved in future, working with the local First Nations. So we did reach out to them, but timelines and all of that kind of stuff, and I feel like this is definitely a gap, and should be considered moving forward as you make plans to make sure that whatever assets are important to the broader community are considered in any plans. All right, so that was the very brief tale of the coastal storm, but the basic gist is that there actually is quite a lot in the way of these coastal storm events today, mostly in the Chesapeake Beach area, and that will get significantly worse. It's going to almost double everything in terms of the impacts going forward, because that sea level rise is fairly significant still, even though it's not as bad as it could be. Okay, same story again very quickly here to people, but obviously the extent of the area that is underwater is much greater, so there's way more people whose homes will be impacted, whose businesses will be impacted. I have the numbers, but I forgot, but it's in the 3,000-ish range of people, 3,600 people affected in a tsunami event. And you may not have noticed, but the colors have switched slightly here. So we've added in sort of some consideration of the velocity, because obviously velocity will damage homes more. It will pick you up more. So we're using Japanese, or actually Australian AIDR codes to give you an understanding of whether it's unsafe to have a structure there or to have a person there. And most things there are red. If you read it, it's unsafe for vehicles and people. All building types are considered vulnerable to failure. And I think I have one with buildings on it as well. Just next slide. Yeah, so the buildings are on here, and again, there's obviously a huge amount of buildings that are vulnerable to failure. And something that we learned through working with the folks at UCL in the UK around their modeling, so they actually have a tank, physical tank, that they model tsunami waves in, and they put little houses in and see what happens. The scenario for tsunamis is that structures are basically binary. They either survive or they completely collapse. And we did, working with Keith, who got some fantastic students from UVic, we actually went out and looked at every building in the community and mapped how tall it is, what it's made of. That's all available now to the district on the GIS, and looked at the likelihood of collapse in a tsunami event. And the folks from UCL reported that about 70% of the buildings would be expected to completely collapse in a tsunami.
I just had a quick
Yes,
question about the number you talked of affected people in the previous at 3,600. Was that a seasonally adjusted figure?
Yes, so I can't remember I have to go back and look at the exact notes of how we did it, but we looked at daytime, I think summer, nighttime populations. So it was a bit of a worst case, most probable kind of scenario to figure that out. But again, like the data is a bit difficult we use the best available data that we could get from the district, including some work that's been done for the tourism. I can't remember where the exact source was, as well as census data, but census data is kind of useless at the scale because District of Tofino, it has, I don't know, 3 or 4 census tracts in it, so that kind of scale is not very helpful. So you can read the many appendices, but there's a lot of what we call dasymetric approaches. So we were applying the census information to buildings. We looked at buildings, we looked at how their square footage, and then we made a guess of like an algorithm. This house will have 5 people in it, or X number of people in it, and then added in the summer daytime tourist load. So that was still, so it's fairly significant still. So it's between 3,000 and 4,000 people who are in that space, probably at a worst. So that's obviously a very significant number of people with very few access and egress routes, which we'll get into a little bit in a minute. And yeah, so here, access, egress. I think this is the really big issues that obviously have been recognized, and partly why we were doing this project was to get the numbers on this. It's a beautiful but long and skinny peninsula with effectively one road along it, and that road will be underwater in cascade subduction tsunami. And so that immediately blocks off access, so the town will be isolated during the event, and then probably after the event, because these events include a lot of debris which will be on the road. And so that's something that sort of really comes into the planning and recommendations here. So how do you manage for this kind of scenario? And I'll get into those a little bit later. And again, we just wanted to acknowledge the fact that the environment matters, and so does culture. Any questions on that bit? I'm going to get into some risk and some results. And so risk, does everyone remember our triangle? Good job. All right, 3 components. Let's hear them from the council. Councillor Stewart.
Hazards.
Vulnerabilities. Mine was hazard.
Exposure. Well done, councillor. All right, so we have those 3 elements that we're now overlaying on top of each other to get to risk. And I put it up on the screen for you. And so the other piece that we're layering into this is the more complex equation for risk. And that we're considering hazard, vulnerability, and exposure there. And that comes together to create consequence. So that's the bad thing that happens. But we're also considering the likelihood of this event occurring, because obviously that plays a huge role into how we plan for these things. You're not going to plan for something that's never going to happen. But you do want to plan for something that is likely to happen. So when you think about risk this way, we're adding in that likelihood piece, and that becomes very important, especially when we want to consider and compare tsunami risk to coastal sea level rise in terms of where you prioritize your efforts going forward to make decisions and plan. Put your money and all of those resources that you have in the community together. So another way to display the consequence of the risk idea is in a risk matrix. So along the bottom, we have likelihood there, very rare through almost certain, consequence on the y-axis, insignificant to catastrophic, and risk increases radially across that diagram. And so what I just want to point out is that the catastrophic event, like a tsunami, is very rare. It might be, sorry, that's actually a bad example. I'll put another example. A small tsunami, or a tsunami in a very isolated place, which will not happen, so it's a completely fictional idea here, will have the same risk associated with it as a small event that happens frequently, but is a kind of a nuisance event. So if you have water in your kitchen every single year, over time that risk is going to be the same as that tsunami event coming in terms of the damages to that home. And so that's something to consider moving forward. And so we use these matrices to try and explain that. And here they all are. So I'm going to leave this one up for a few seconds. And so what we've done here is looked at each of those categories that I mentioned earlier. So people, and we've added in mortality and missing people into the tsunami scenario. We don't consider that really an issue for the coastal storm scenario. You already do a super job of getting people off your beaches when the tides and the storm is really great, the hazard's really great. So we were trying to be hopeful there, and we've taken that category out for the coastal storm. And so we've got those categories there. So mortality, missing, affected people, people whose homes or livelihoods are affected by an event, economic impacts, impacts to critical infrastructure and disruption, environment and culture. And so what this story tells to me, and we do a lot of this work across BC and across Canada, you don't have the highest risk out there. There are other communities who are worse off than you for various reasons, different types of hazards, for example. But the hazard is very, very high, or the risk is very, very high, and it's very consistent. So the risk is, there's not sort of one thing that your eyes drawn to as being more important than something else. So you're not saying, let's focus on infrastructure over economy, because everything is pretty much the same. And the other thing that really sort of I'm drawn to is the fact that it's actually, they're quite similar for both the coastal storm event as the tsunami event. And so focusing all your efforts on a tsunami event, obviously super important, because the thing that probably people care about the most is that mortality issue and the risk to life. That is very, very important, but it shouldn't be dealt with at the cost of not considering the coastal flood hazard and sea level rise. And so in the top graphic there, you'll see the icons are shifting, and that shift sort of denotes what's happening with sea level rise. And things are getting worse. And we're not going to be able to change that here, even if we stopped all emissions today, or this was actually like 2 years ago information. So if we had stopped emitting greenhouse gases 2 years ago, we would still expect sea level rise until the year 3000 because of all of the latent heat in the system right now. So this is something that's not going away. It's something that we have to manage for, and it is increasing. And so I think it's really important for council and staff moving forward just to consider both of these things and not to focus all the efforts on the tsunami, because it does seem like the more scary thing, because there is actually a lot of opportunity to do things about coastal sea level rise and coastal flood hazards. So the other thing, and this is like our little pet project, and Keith let us do it, so thank you, was we wanted to look at this spatially, which we always do. And so here's a spatial map of people. And what we did here, if you delved into the report and liked your statistics and you like integrating things, basically we integrated the risk here. And so we think this is actually the first time this has been done in Canada, to consider the sum of all of the potential hazard and likelihood from coastal storm events. So we looked at the small events, we looked at the medium events, and we looked at the larger events, because we had a whole series of maps that were done in the first phase of work. And we basically integrated those all up and did a bunch of math. Well, I didn't do the math, I had people who are better at that kind of stuff than me do all of the detailed math and various codes and things to develop this map. But this really sort of highlights the cumulative impacts and cumulative risk to people from floods, from those really rare events through those much more frequent events. And again, it really it highlights the areas that matter, the areas where the focus needs to be. And it's again Chesterman Beach and Cox Bay, with that little piece there in the downtown core as well, where there are people who will be impacted. So yeah, we're hoping that you will be co-authors with us on a few papers, because we're pretty excited by this. And then again, we did it for economy, and again, it basically tells the same story, that the areas that have the most risk, where risk is the cumulative impacts of all of those big events and small events, again, it's the same area. So it really sort of helps, I think, to focus everybody on where things need to be thought about the most. And so quickly, in summary, risk to life, I think, for the tsunami is very, very high, and I think we all recognize that, and that really is a function of the number of people, the 3,000 to 4,000 people who are in the way of the potential tsunami wave. It is very rare, it's unlikely, so right now it's currently pegged at a 1 over 350 chance of occurring in any year at the moment, based on when the last one occurred about 700 years, halfway between, that kind of thing. But you know, if it did occur, it would be catastrophic. But risk to all the other categories is also very high, and it's equally high for the tsunami and the coastal storm. So I think that should really drive some decisions going forward in terms of prioritizing what work gets done. Risk obviously does increase with climate change. Sea level rise is something that's going to matter. It's really going to matter here, especially in Chesterfield Beach, where the whole area, the areas get so much deeper and bigger. So risk does change with things like climate change and change in exposure, but it also means that you can reduce your risk. So we go back to our little triangle. We can do things about that triangle. We can't do much about the hazard at this point. Like that tsunami will happen at some point. Coastal storms will happen. Sea level rise is definitely happening. But we have two other arms to play with. We have exposure and we have vulnerability. So that's really, I think, the focus of where things need to change going forward. And so we have risk reduction strategies, or things that you shouldn't do in terms of making your hazard worse, or risk worse. So in terms of the exposure side, not increasing density in those areas where you have the greatest hazard right now. So Chesterfield Beach, Cox Bay, so not putting large rental units right down there, for example, would be, you know, avoiding making your scenario even worse. I think it's going to be a really key thing going forward in terms of the planning, the bylaws, and the regulations. And then when you have people who are there over time, so the sea level rise issue, yes, it's an issue today. It's going to get worse in future, but it's not one of those things that you can't deal with. Like it's something that the planning horizons and the turnover of buildings and communities happens at a similar pace to sea level rise happening. So we're expecting sea level rise by the year 2100, but you'll probably have nearly all the homes in that region turnover or get renovated or change in that period. So there's actually an opportunity there to sort of really to use that information and that time to make those buildings less vulnerable and less susceptible to damage through the use of things like flood construction levels, raising up some of the buildings, raising up the main services, raising up the things that matter in those homes. There's a whole whack of really interesting buildings that are being built, not yet in Canada because we're still working on advocating at the provincial level to change some of the building bylaws and building codes. But there are ways that you can design buildings so that when they get wet, you recover really fast. You just put your electrical outlets up, you put tile down instead of sheetrock and that kind of thing. Like there's quite simple solutions that are available to support having buildings being wet. And that's sort of, when you think about the coastal storm as well, it's not something that's going to happen every single day. It's going to happen once a year, it's going to happen twice a year, or once every 3 or 4 years. So you don't want to completely sterilize your community to manage for that hazard that's not going to be there all the time. And so it's important to think about vulnerability and fragility of buildings to do that. All right, here's my happy note of like, this is getting worse, but we can bring this down by really changing the consequence, by changing the exposure and the vulnerability. And so if we go back to the UN, UNISDR, so they're the folks who do the Sendai framework, resilience, which is like sort of corollary to risk, so this is the good thing. It's the ability of a community to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt, transform, and recover from hazard. And I think it's important to understand that it's all of those things. It's not just resisting and stopping the water, because that's not going to happen here. But it's about recovering after the event and making sure that your community, you know, in the moment, will manage the event and then be able to recover over the next 6 months, 2 years, 10 years, whatever it is. And so that's and so another really important issue is to think about this risk. You know, it is a very scary thing. And there is risk that is unacceptable. So there are risks, you know, that some people will not take, some people won't jump out of an airplane, some people whatever. Like there's all those risks that you, as an individual and you as a community, will decide are unacceptable or acceptable to you, and there's a line there of risk tolerance. But I think that the key here is that you can't always reduce risk down to that tolerable level. You can only reduce your risk as much as practicable, which is a word I looked it up last night just to check. I was going to say practical. Really, it's a word. And then manage the risk. So we can't reduce the risk entirely, and so we just have to be aware of where we're playing in this. So we now know where the risk is, and you know, I think Keith is thinking a little bit about, working on figuring out what is the risk tolerance, and then once you know that number, you can figure out how you're going to manage to try and get down there. But you're going to probably have to accept some of the risk. You're never going to get it down to the point where it is tolerable, especially once the larger community starts really understanding these risks. So, in summary, for tsunami, based on the work that was done by the folks at EPIC in the UK, and the building structures that are here, it basically is fairly impractical to design any buildings to withstand a tsunami. So if you were in the workshop, you got to see some of the videos of their flume with the buildings and the scour. That was something that I learned through this project, is that that's a really huge issue, and I think on the soils that are here, the sediments that are here. When the wave comes in, just imagine like playing on the beach with your water, you put a stick in, you see the scour come around it. That's what's going to happen around all of these buildings. It's going to scour out and they're going to tip over. So on the bright side, this constraint really sort of focuses what you need to do when it comes to tsunami. So I think the community is not going to physically survive a tsunami, and so the focus really has to be on that risk to life piece and then on the recovery piece. And so in terms of risk of life, I'll let Aaron talk about this momentarily. Obviously, there are some thoughts on the table already with regards to, say, a vertical evacuation structure to support those 3,000 to 4,000 people in Chesterton Beach and Cox Bay who aren't going to be able to get out because there's so many people in one road, and that road's probably going to be damaged because it's going to happen after the earthquake. So there are other tools available to support increasing the likelihood of survival of this event. And then once that event has gone, we've had the ebb tide, it's really about that long-term recovery and making sure that the community is prepared, the town site's prepared to be isolated for a very long time, and to recover and support your community who's going to be damaged and hurt, as well as all of those outlying communities that we noted at the beginning. Those are going to be important to consider. And I think Keith can talk more about it maybe afterwards, or Aaron, but I mean, these are things that are very present on the mind of your staff already. So it's there. It's just a matter of getting everything lined up and making sure that the broader community knows about these things. Coastal storm, I think, is a bit of a different story because there are practical things you can do about this. So now that you know where these areas are, I think the first thing that's really obvious is avoiding making it any worse. Let's avoid putting people in those areas of high hazard density. I think probably you're already there just through other things that you're doing in the community in terms of not densifying that area. And then we can decrease vulnerability to buildings. Like I said, there's a bunch of examples of how buildings can survive being wet better and be recovered really fast. And obviously the community is thinking about putting in, updating the OCP, putting in potentially development permit areas, requiring flood construction levels, requiring that all the important things in a home are higher. These are the kind of things that are really, really important and over time can be extremely effective at reducing the impacts of an event. And they're very doable, so I think that's the thing that sort of is important to know, that it's not something that you're alone doing. Every community on the coast of BC right now is grappling with these issues in various ways. And there are some examples of sort of how this is moving forward at bylaw level and OCP and that kind of thing. The other point I think I want to make is that we have to think about these. I've been sort of dividing these hazards into two separate things, but we really do have to have a little bit of an all hazards mentality. So obviously the tsunami will probably be prefaced by a large earthquake. So we don't want to have be making decisions here that will actually make one of these other things worse. So for a long time, I was describing flood protected home as being up on stilts. But there's a seismic engineer I worked with down in Victoria who came up to me, slapped me on my wrist and said no, because as soon as you put a home on stilts, it becomes much more likely to fail in an earthquake. So we have to think through these things. So we can't be designing and making decisions about planning or building design that work for one hazard on their own if they're going to fail another one. Another one that came up when we had the folks in the UCL here is they were looking around at the community and some of the places where people have put in beach protection. So we've got rocks and riprap and stuff along the shore in a few spots. That will become a projectile in a tsunami. And that's actually a big part of the damages to homes. It's not actually the water. It's the boats, it's the logs, it's all of the other shipping containers or whatever else is out there in the water that might come through a home and damage it. And those rip-rap rocks, which are designed, as a junior engineer, I spent a lot of time sizing those rocks. So they're sized and they're really strong, but they're not strong enough to manage the momentum of a tsunami wave, and they will just be lifted up and thrown into the community. So these are the kind of things that you want to think through. You don't want to be designing just for one hazard because it might make another hazard worse. Just very briefly, one thing that's really easy, I think, is just adopting that language of resilience and thinking about that as something that your community wants to do anything. It's the language of a healthy community. You want your community to be resilient to all kinds of things, to affordability of housing, for, economic changes with the fisheries or whatever it is. You want your community to be resilient, and so if you just sort of take that mindset, you're going to become more resilient to all of these things, whether they're natural hazards or others. And so it's actually, I think, as long as you can mainstream those ideas, it's going to benefit you regardless, and it's relatively easy to do because you're doing it already. That's all I have to say. Thank you, and thank you very much again, and thank you to our fantastic district staff here as well who supported us all the way along. We have awesome favorite clients.
Good.
Any questions? Or you want to finish?
I'll give it.
Okay, go on.
I think it's really short. I don't really have much to add to that.
It's hard to add to that.
I have a house for sale. So we get into some real estate. I sort of want to bring it all together a little bit and just touch on some of the resilient pieces that Tamsin touched on at the end. A lot of this work is continuing, through the grant writing that we're doing. A lot of some of the projects that we're considering for the future to start becoming more resilient are already in your 5-year plan, and you may see some more projects pop up in 2020 and 2021. In terms of some of the maps and sort of on a really basic planning and building level, we're using them, building inspectors use them now on a daily basis to decide if people are in areas of concern or whether they need engineers or not, so that the work that we received is already coming into play. In terms of the tsunami recommendations, we're working with Carla
Robinson
from who used to work with Fluid on an evacuation plan. We're continuing to work on the vertical evacuation plan for the south of Tofino. We're looking, just applied for a grant. We just signing a contract this week for the tsunami risk mitigation plan, which may include some requirements for that consultant to write us further grants for structural mitigation. We have ongoing education, and of course a lot of land. We're starting to bring this now into our land use planning. In terms of flooding, obviously one of the big ones for us is starting to really consider where we want to put future development, and maybe not in the next 5 years, but for sure in the next 50 and definitely in the next 100 and 200 years. The way we do that in municipalities through our OCP zoning, development permit bylaws. We're looking to start working on a floodplain bylaw this upcoming summer, probably fall, spring, summer of next year. That is sort of a multidisciplinary group within the district. So it'll be with myself and Keith, Peter, and Nicholas. We're looking at bringing some of this information into public works and engineering, so to make sure that our infrastructure that we're thinking about building or improving, we've considered this. Is this something that's going to last us 50 years? And if so, what are we doing to protect it, or what are we doing to ensure that we're not throwing good money after bad? And so I think as we move forward with asset management projects and the planning, this will become forefront. This will be forefront. And again, this is just work that we're just going to start it, and we're going to start working towards it, and it should benefit our future populations in 20 and 30 years. I have this really small. I'll flip through it. If council is interested, I said, you guys, it's a cow though. Well, I'll do that cow. I'm going to show you some maps, and if you'd like to stop and pause on the maps. And basically what we've done with our GIS consultants is bring in a lot of this information into our district GIS. So we have a lot of information now. So I'm just going to flip through that quickly. So that's sort of Tofino today. This is sort of based on the maps that Tamsin has shared with us already. This is the one in 200 year, or the 0.5% annual exceedance probability. storm at 0 meters sea level. That's with so 5.5 meters, which these are rough numbers of 50 years, depending on how fast sea level rise occurs. That's what it looks like at 100, and that's what it looks like at 200 years. So we can sort of see that we can start now planning for what we may have to deal with in 50, 100, to 200 years. I pulled this map image out because what we have here is Long Beach Lodge there in the middle. And a couple of years ago we had a really quite a large storm, and from what I understood it may have been a 1 in 500 year storm rather than 1 in 200, it might be a bit larger. But you can sort of see even already that it's starting to come up some of the beach accesses here and here. So if you add a little bit of sea level there, that starts to look like what that storm actually did, what actually happened there when their patio was flooded. And so you can sort of just see what that looks like, and then again, what it looks like in 200 years. Tsunami map, I think we're all familiar with. I just thought I'd pull out a couple of interesting ones for us, is that even if the Cascade subduction zone, our hospital is still standing, and it looks like it's relatively unaffected. The schools there, the community halls are sort of our critical places for people to go after an event, are still somewhat are okay. We can sort of see this, the sort of middle of the community is quite inundated. The part that I found really interesting about this one is this area in here, which is currently provincial land, but was a part of the treaty discussions with the Tokut during the treaty process, is quite high. And so as we talk about evacuation, vertical evacuation, there may be opportunities in the future to consider more horizontal evacuation as well. And so just the idea that these maps are already helping us sort of start to decide how we move forward with the evacuation plan, but also again for where we might want to consider future growth in 100 years from now, 50 years from now. Chesterman Beach, I don't know if there's much to say about that.
Next slide.
And of course, Cox Bay, which I think is obviously highlighted in Townsend's presentation. So those are my maps. I'll leave right down. I'm sticking around. I think we're gonna be okay.
You're not moving to Port Alberta out of the inundation zone.
Not yet.
Maybe in 100 years.
Maybe in 200 years. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Townsend. Thank you, Keith. I just especially want to say thank you to Keith, because I think without Keith's persistence, a lot of this work wouldn't have been done, and part of that persistence is your ability to go out, find funding, apply for it before telling anyone practically, and getting money. And so to that end, I want to really thank Bob and Aaron too for supporting him, and everyone on our staff for supporting him. To me, a lot of this work is a lot like the asset management work we've been doing over the last few years, where it's our ability to be realistic and practical and accept that we have to have this kind of information to properly plan for the future that makes us the councils that we've been in the past couple of terms. So I'm really glad to see this happening. I think it's really, really important. Questions? Anyone? No. Everyone's too stunned. The maps. But yeah, it is really important, and I think that I guess if I had one question, I would say, how do you take a very technical and detailed report like this, and even though that we as a district of Tofino are really beginning to embrace and use this kind of information, how do you get it out into the general public so that it kind of becomes part of the zeitgeist of Tofino, and that people who are applying for rezonings or for building permits or for DPs or whatever it is, that they begin to see more and more and more of this, and it kind of filters out into the community. And so I wonder, to that end, and I don't know that the province has even thought this far ahead, but boy, would it be great to see some kind of funding where they could put towards taking this kind of stuff and actually turning it into more digestible and public-facing, friendly communications material. Maybe that's something we can talk to
I think I just
the
add
powers that
a
be.
little bit on
Please,
that.
thanks, Townsend.
Yeah, there's some really good examples of where this is happening.
Uh-huh.
And I would encourage you to go talk to those councils and that staff. So somewhere like the District of North Vancouver, certainly they're considered world leaders on this issue, and it was a result of the 2005 Berkeley slide where there was a mortality, there was a death. And so they really changed and transformed how they dealt with it. So instead of hiding everything, they really went out and started engaging with their community. And so one of the things that they have is they do have DPAs, and they have what's for hazard areas, and there's actually only about 15 properties in the North Van which don't have a hazard of some kind because they've got the wildfire and the earthquake. So you're doing awesome here. Anyways, the point being there is that they have an online tool now, so any, and it also tied to their asset stuff too, and their sustainability stuff. So any homeowner can go in and plug their address in, and it'll pop up and say, you're in this hazard zone, and here's the nearest report that somebody has had written by a qualified professional. So if your neighbor up the street's had a qualified professional write a report, that report's available to that homeowner. And I think it's relative, so we actually are doing some work for the North Shore right now, and so we've been getting access to how often that site is checked. And it is quite consistently accessed, and it's partly because it's also things about the aspect of your roof to put on your sun panels or your solar panels, and so it's tied into all of the stuff that homeowners and renters and whoever are trying to get access to anyways. So that's a really good example. City of Surrey is an excellent example. On the sea level rise work, they've been working what's called CFAS, Coastal Flood Adaptation Study, very out there in the public, a lot of community engagement in a neighborhood not dissimilar to Chesterman Beach or Crescent Beach. Lots of very wealthy homeowners totally underwater very soon. And so that's been a big process for them, but they have a lot of online tools. They have story maps. They've been doing readings in the public library with the story maps. So we did this website for them, and they go with iPads to the community and sit down with a bunch of old folks and get them to play on the iPads to understand the risk. That's a really good example. So, and there is funding available. I think that's the other thing. So some of these programs, like the NDMP, I have been working with the Fraser Basin Council on the Lower Mainland, and we actually got, I can't remember what it was like close to $500,000 to develop a website and portal for the public to understand flood hazard risk, and it includes videos and a bunch of social media stuff. It's not ready yet, clearly. I'm learning all sorts of web language. It's a wireframe right now, but it'll be available towards March next year, and that will also have some things that will be relevant to everybody who's dealing with these issues. So they do kind of exist, and it's something that's certainly on the minds, I think, of EUBC as well as Public Safety Canada and Natural Resources Canada. It's definitely something, because understanding, and it's like it's definitely the first part of knowing. People know that this is their risk, especially if they know they can do something about it. Like when they renovate their home, making smart choices is really, really important, because then the onus isn't just on you as the council, it's on individuals to do something about this. Thanks.
I just wanted to thank you. Obviously, I won't reiterate everything, all the comprehensive work that's gone in, comprehensive report that was there, and some of the takeaways from the presentation and the report. The language of resiliency strongly came out. The no regret actions and the quick wins through the DPAs and the land use planning tools and the floodplain bylaws. Another thing very valuable that was a takeaway. The one thing I had, and it's one of those semi-technical, but it's not. I was just looking at your figures, and it's just my own curiosity. You know, we're looking at a global sea level rise. A lot of the modeling was at that 1 meter level, and in the data that you presented, there was, as of 1993, a 3.2 millimeter rise globally that was predicted. And then we're fortunate here that we are actually rising, fortunately. And just, so doing the quick math and just subtracting, and it gave me a 1 meter rise in about 333 years. Would that be realistic?
So I didn't show it because I was trying to cut back the slides, but the curve for sea level rise is not linear. Okay. It does this. And if you look at and what we're working with in BC, that 1 meter that we're using is a provincial guideline, and it's based on I know you're doing a climate thing in a minute, so I can use this language. So we're going to go, it's the IPCC AR4, so it's the science from about 2008 that was used to develop that current curve that is being used in BC with the 1 meter sea level rise. And so the curve looks like this, and then the provincial government, I think in their wisdom, put a straight line on it to help people like yourselves understand that it really does this, but it will meet that point based on the science from 2008. If anyone's been paying attention to the news, we know that all that science was wrong. There's so many feedback loops that we didn't know about at the time, and so one of the big ones that's in the sea level rise world right now is the Western Antarctic. ice sheet, which at the time no one even could fathom would fail. But this is a big whack of ice in the Antarctic that is it's cracking every time you open climate science. It's very depressing. It's going. And so we're seeing this rapid rise, and the more science we know, the steeper that curve is getting. And so there's something called the Hansen curve. So that's a scientist, Hansen, who's got a paper from, I think it's 2016 now, so again, it's already out of date. And that curve has the global sea level rise almost tripling by the year 2100. And so we could potentially see that. But I'll start again. Don't panic yet, because that 1 meter that the province decided on quite a long time ago was quite conservative, and I think a very smart choice. But I think expecting that it's going to be less than that is not a wise choice. But I think the other thing is to know, and I again took the slides out because it's in the report there somewhere, but a big part of this is all of the uncertainty associated with this. And so what's really important is to design with resilience in mind, but design with uncertainty in mind. So you want whatever you're putting in these areas to be adaptable to many different futures. And so you may have less sea level rise, you may have more sea level rise, but if you're putting in a hard structure, and so I often use a dike, this is a good easy example to understand. If you're designing a dike for that 1 meter of sea level rise, and you put all of your eggs in that basket, and then actually sea level rise is much greater than that, then that's a complete waste of money. And if sea level rise is less than that, it's also a waste because you've built this enormous piece of infrastructure that has blocked your access to the beach, has totally changed your community and how you interact with the ocean or the river. And so it's important to think about designing solutions, so homes, for example, that can withstand water, that are adaptable to having 2 meters of water in the basement or in the ground floor, or 10 centimeters or nothing. Right? You're not losing anything by designing a home with tiles on the floor. It's something that you're probably going to derive some benefit from regardless. So I think that's a really important message, that there is uncertainty, but it is happening. Don't assume it's going to be less. Sorry.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thanks, Tamsin.
Thanks for having me back.
Thanks for coming back. Such a thorough presentation. And more presentation. Nyla. Poor Nyla. Hi, Nyla. Hi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentlemen.
Thanks very much.
I will never accuse you of being a climate denier. Climate change denier. Okay, Q2. Good evening, everyone. This is a Q2 financial report, and I guess some councillors this is the first time we're going through the quarterly report. So just a reminder that this report is mostly a project status update or an update on major budget items. The Q3 report is a more substantive report that goes through more of the numbers and whether the project went over or under budget versus actual and the operational budget. So this is a fairly brief update comparatively. So I'll begin the presentation with just a short financial officer's report, and then each department manager will come up, with the exception of the manager of public spaces. I will present on her behalf if she's not here this evening. So 2019 property taxation tax notices are sent out the end of May of each year, so taxes are due in Q3, so I'll have a report on tax collection at the Q3 financial update. This year there was a difference. If council recalls, the penalty bylaw was repealed, and there's a 10% penalty for any late payment of taxes after July 2nd. There were 3 supplementary adjustments in 2019 up to the end of Q2, 2 residential properties and 1 property that has residential and business. So we're looking at a total refund of $7,323. That's fairly small compared to prior years. A lot of that we will be able to recover through the requisitions. That should be a small amount that we could recover through contingency, or that if there are further supplementary adjustments in the year, we'll bring that back for during the budget discussion. There was no tax sale in 2018. If there was a tax sale, this is the time where we would start to talk about whether the property was redeemed by the property owner, which means that the taxes that were outstanding were paid in full.
and it remains with the property owner, but there was no tax sale last year, so that's, we don't need to discuss that. Currently, there are 13 properties with delinquent taxes, meaning this is the third year that taxes have not been paid. 2 of those properties are foreshore properties. They cannot go to tax sale. We're unsure at this time whether there will be a tax sale. We are actively pursuing tax collection, and we will do so up to the last Monday in September when tax sale occurs at 10 a.m. So the delinquent taxes that are owing currently are $67,613. As of June 30th, the balance in taxes and arrears, which is taxes that haven't been paid for 2 years on accounts, make up $132,747. I'd like to provide an update on contingency fund balances. The first row of, or first column of numbers is what the contingency balance was at the beginning of the year, so we have had very little allocated from contingency as of the end of Q2. That's fairly typical. We will see more contingency allocations in Q3, so this will be a more thorough update at that time when we come back in November to discuss. So moving on to the departments, I'll just go over the public spaces updates. I won't have any more details than what's provided on the slides. If you do have questions, I can get the manager to reply back by email at a later date. The 2019 seasonal shuttle, everyone is aware that it is running and will continue to do so, I believe, until the end of Labor Day weekend. The budget for that is $170,000. Campbell Street upgrade phase 3, the design will begin in the fall or winter. Monks Point Park planning is ongoing. The Village Green Playground project update is a replacement is complete. The actual cost was $151,000. We were able to use some more RMI funds to cover off the additional costs. Multi-use path improvements, April to Sea Otter, will take place beginning in September of this year. Multi-use path extension is in progress and the tender is underway. Centennial Park riparian has not started yet, and we don't have an expected date of commencement for that one. We do have a recommendation for council as part of this report. One of the fleet vehicles conked out early, so we do need to replace it. So this is funds that we can use from our capital and infrastructure levy that we collect. We are required to include in the financial plan any use of those funds by bylaw. So this is a recommendation to council that we use some of those capital and infrastructure levy funds in the public works equipment reserve to replace this fleet vehicle. And I don't know if council is open to making this recommendation or this resolution now, or if you'd like to come back to the end. There are no further recommendations to amend the financial plan bylaw as part of this update or today's update.
Okay, thanks. And since we're in committee, it has to come to council anyways.
Yes.
So because this is a new process for 3 people here, I'm not averse to just saying there's time to think and ask questions about how this works, and so that we have a report or whatever you need to bring to council on the 27th. But I don't know if I want to put anyone on the spot about having the cow make a recommendation. So up to you guys.
I think probably we're going to move forward with it. So if this would expedite the process, if this, I'm happy with moving.
Okay. Good. Great.
How old is it? It's not that old, is it?
It's not that old. It was supposed to last, I believe, 4 years longer than what we expected. I don't know.
I think it's 2014 rings a bell.
2013. We purchased in 2013, but it was supposed to last, I believe, 12 years.
So why didn't it?
That I don't know.
It's a lemon. It keeps on breaking down. It's not misused. It's not used a lot either. If it's not one thing, it's the other with that vehicle.
We had issues with that as soon as we bought it, didn't we?
What's that?
We had issues with it as soon as we bought it in the first year.
So what do you do as a staff to have this not happen again?
Well, I believe there was some exposure to the element, so safeguarding the assets is something that I always try and look at and try and figure out ways we could protect the assets to make sure this doesn't happen again. Keeping it in a covered space is probably ideal versus outside for some vehicles more than others. this one's fairly open. It's not like a regular vehicle, so I would recommend that it be kept in a more enclosed space in the yard or covered at least.
It's also recommended to be replaced with a different type of vehicle, something that is more useful for trail access.
Right.
Whereas this one is often a little too big or a little too damaging on the trail itself. So that's what we're looking into.
Good. I don't have a problem approving it, I just want to make sure it, whatever we get lasts a little bit longer.
Would you like to make the motion, Councillor McMaster?
I'll move that council amend the financial plan to use 20.
You have it?
I have different wording. My apologies. April put the slide together and I didn't change the language, so I do have the language. I can read